Greetings and salutations. This is the voice of Loquacious of Herd, bringing you his afterthoughts on My Little Pony, Friendship is Magic, Season 6, Episode 22, titled Pony Point of View. I heartily suggest that you find and watch the episode itself, sans commentary, before proceeding with either this Afterthoughts review or viewing my full reaction, which is hosted at the link in the description. Be warned, this Afterthoughts review will contain spoilers for the episode. With that out of the way, on to the review. This season has been very good about exploring some different themes in storytelling, as well as referencing classic stories and story tropes. This episode was yet another variation on a familiar theme, the Rashomon effect. This term is used to describe a circumstance where the same event is given contradictory interpretations by the different individuals involved. The name comes from Akira Kurosawa's 1950 film Rashomon, where an assault, a robbery, and a murder involving 4 individuals, suspect, witness, and the victims, both living and dead, is described in 4 mutually contradictory ways. Of course, it's not just that different people have different points of view on what really happened. Determining which aspects of each story are most factually accurate and which are most colored by the expectation and perspective is a key point. Such subjectivity can be particularly frustrating when one is looking for closure on the question of what really happened. We begin with Twilight trotting in from stage right, followed by a hurrying Spike. The perspective on this scene, the point of view for the camera, is a near-perfect mirror of one of the scenes in the opening credits, and it's an angle we've rarely, if ever, seen before. It struck me as instantly familiar, yet also entirely new, backward from what I was expecting. I applaud this lovely use of animation to convey, right off the bat, that this is a story where perspective will be important. In some ways, perspective is the story. Twilight's nervous-sighted about the return of Pinkie Pie, Rarity, and Applejack from their Seaward Shoals boat trip. Fluttershy and Rainbow Dash weren't involved, as those two were off at their Cloudsdale Flight School reunion. What a lovely nod to one of the IDW comics, specifically issue 18 titled Friends Forever, where, as mentioned, Fluttershy and Rainbow Dash go to their Cloudsdale Flight School reunion. For those who, like myself, thought, I wonder how that reunion went, well, check out the comic. The writers have referenced it. We also get the first mention of how each of the 3 central characters in this episode, Pinkie Pie, Rarity, and Applejack, were all looking forward to getting out of their element. Not so much element of harmony, though it can be amusing to think of it in that way, but out of their element in terms of trying something a little different for a change. Rarity is always making with the glitz and glamour. Pinkie Pie is always involved with wild parties and frivolity. Applejack is always working closely with farm and family. A little break from these well-established and well-enjoyed routines would make for a nice vacation for those 3. Also, cue the first of the Twilight asking Spike to take notes running gags throughout the episode. Secretary Spike is various shades of unamused by having quill and parchment thrust upon him every time it looks like a story is about to be told, but he does his part to record events, even when this interferes with his snacking. The train arrives. Pinkie Pie, Rarity, and Applejack debark. From their state of wild dishevelment, we know that it was an eventful trip. From their angry glares at one another, their silence in the face of Twilight's question, and their insistence on going their own ways, in Pinkie's case, over the train rather than walking with either AJ or Rarity, it's also clear that they're none too pleased with their fellow vacationers. So now, into the meat of the story. Twilight's attempt to find out what happened, and, armed with that knowledge, effect a reconciliation between 3 of her friends. Her first attempt, by inviting them all to tea at her castle, so as to mutually share their experience and explain what had occurred as a group, only serves to highlight exactly how badly each of these 3 friends are taking the whole kerfluffle. None of them show up, each instead sending their pet with a note, in Gummy's case, one scrawled upon his belly, indicating that they will not be attending a function where the other 2 are likely to be. So, Twilight sets off to speak with each pony individually, getting their story, their point of view, on what had occurred during their sailing outing. The first of the 3 stories is Rarity's, and on arriving at Carousel Boutique, we find Rarity is still in the process of recovery, a process which includes disentangling a crab from her mane. This was unexpected. I have to wonder if this was a nod to a meme that started up back in 2013, namely Rarity fighting a giant crab. The original illustration, a request made to an artist in fandom if I recall correctly, was sufficiently ridiculous that it spawned a surprisingly enthusiastic series of images and stories involving Rarity fighting giant crustaceans. Our fandom is a silly thing, which is one of its many charms. It was still odd to see a subtle nod to that bit of fan-created whimsy within the show itself. Rarity initially does her overly dramatic thing, huzzah for the return of her fainting couch, and she refuses to talk, which is fine by Spike, no note-taking that way, but Rarity immediately relents so she can share her side of the story. I could just summarize Rarity's version by gushing the phrase, "Pirate Applejack," with variations for several minutes straight, but let's review instead. Rarity, knowing her two friends were wanting something a little out of their usual element, so to speak, made the preparations to turn their boat trip into an elegant cruise. While Rarity herself would be staying firmly in her element, she would be using her expertise within it to provide a welcome respite from Pinky's usual whimsical partying and Applejack's usual grounded farm-related focus. We get our first look at Seaward Shoals, and it is a lovely town. Also that boat, a lower and upper deck, a nice cabin with a stern castle, 2 masts, 3 sails, and an impressive flag. Quite the ship for 3 ponies to tootle about the bay and explore the coast. Somehow, I immediately doubted that Rarity arrived with only the single tiny bag she described. Indeed, Rarity's depictions of her own actions seem to be a bit on the too nice end of the spectrum. Not that I'm saying Rarity isn't the sort to be as kind, considerate, and polite as she makes herself out to be. That's all Rarity at her best. Rarity as she sees herself, and Rarity as she intends and strives to be. Kudos to her that much of the time she strikes closer to that mark than she misses it. However, as the tale unfolds, I found myself, like Twilight, having growing suspicions that perhaps Rarity's role might not have been exactly as Rarity remembers it. Now, it might not have been all that far off from how Rarity tells it, but we do need to take her word with a little grain of salt. What becomes more interesting is Rarity's point of view on her two friends. Rarity's take on Pinkie Pie seems pretty on point, but then Pirate Applejack. It soon becomes clear that Rarity is most unhappy with Applejack, and that she blames AJ for the disaster, and, as we later learn, the sinking of their boat. So while Rarity's perception of Pinkie Pie doesn't seem greatly out of character for our favorite party pony, Applejack seems wildly over the top, a caricature of her in sea captain form, rather than how we've come to understand AJ really would be acting in the situation as described. Rarity's anger at Applejack is clearly coloring her recollections, and coloring it well past socially acceptable and expected mild exaggeration for effect, and to the point of, that's clearly not anything like what really happened. But this is Rarity's story, told from her point of view. This is how she remembers it, and it's got her quite upset at Applejack as a result. Although I, for one, would absolutely love more Pirate Applejack episodes. It sounded like Ashley Ball had a blast with this interpretation of her character. Rarity's version of the story ends with the sinking of their ship, all of which was Applejack's fault, to hear Rarity tell it. But we don't get an answer to how they made it back to shore. Twilight expresses a gentle concern that perhaps everything might not have unfolded exactly as Rarity recalls. Rarity, in a bit of a huff, suggests checking with Pinkie Pie to confirm Rarity's story. So, off to Pinkie Pie. Wow, Pinkie Pie is really having a season where she's upset and in an angry mood, far more so than in earlier seasons at least. Grumble Pie immediately poo-poos Rarity's perspective on events, and then goes on to share her own point of view, because, from Pinkie's point of view, it was Rarity's constant interference with Applejack's captaincy that led to the boat sinking. As with Rarity, Pinkie Pie was trying to give her two friends something that would be a bit different for them, namely a silly party cruise. And while AJ seemed willing to go along with it, and Pinkie could certainly handle incorporating AJ's own ideas, Rarity was having none of it. A new take on the story, and while I can certainly see Rarity being as enthusiastically glamorous in her arrival, Pinkie's view of Rarity's luggage seems to have gone to the opposite extreme. Where Rarity describes her baggage as one tiny little purse, Pinkie remembers her arriving with a team of porters to stow her luggage. Also, yet more kudos to the show. The music, as Rarity's bags are being brought in by a seemingly unending stream of nautical porters, sounds very like Ravel's Bolero, or a close adaptation of it. In Akira Kurosawa's 1950 movie Rashomon, Kurosawa specifically requested that Fumio Hayasaka, who wrote the musical score for the movie, include an adaptation of Bolero to serve as the leitmotif for The Woman's Story. This sort of careful, thoughtful referencing of source material is something that My Little Pony does so very well. It is one of the many sources of delight that I find in the episodes, and hunting for such hidden treasures is one of the reasons I find it so very rewatchable. Finally, for those who might not be aware, the role of porters is to carry bags and boxes. They aren't necessarily sailors, and as such, they're the ponies who would have carried Rarity's bags onto the ship, but then left the ship once those bags were aboard. Applejack's role, in Pinkie's version, seems much more in character. AJ's embracing the whole nautical thing, but not going so wildly overboard with it, nor acting in a manner that would seem to lead to the capsizing of their vessel. Rarity, on the other hoof, is at her insufferable worst from Pinkie Pie's perspective. So much so that her actions and the results lead both Twilight and I to wonder exactly how much Pinkie's current displeasure with Rarity is coloring her memory of events. Again, circumstances intervene before we get a real answer of how they got back to port from their shipwreck, but now it's on to Applejack's version of events. And while Applejack is the element of honesty, telling the truth still means telling the truth as you remember it. Perspective, point of view, and emotion will still cloud and distort events. What is interesting is that, rather than completing a balanced trio of stories by blaming Pinkie Pie exclusively and giving Rarity a pass, Applejack blames both of her co-vacationers equally. Yet again, Applejack had found an activity, high-seas adventure and treasure hunting, which was outside the normal scope of fun activities for all of her friends. Extra kudos to her, she was the only one of the three ponies who also found an activity which, while quite a different kind of fun than her friends normally indulged in, was also something new and different for she herself. This is a contributing factor in my own thought that if Applejack had been officially placed in charge, this could have really been a fun excursion for all concerned, and a fascinating tale could have come from it. I'd greet a story about an elegant cruise or party boating with a rather meh-ish expression of moderate disinterest, but an adventure outing in search of buried pirate treasure? Sign me up! Likewise, since Applejack seemed intent on spreading the blame between Pinkie and Rarity, each of those two, while out of character in a bad way, may not have been always quite so far gone as Pinkie's version of Rarity, nor Rarity's version of Applejack. Further, Applejack, in speaking of herself, may have stayed a bit closer to her own actual words and deeds than the other two storytellers. As an example, while Rarity's teeny-tiny bag in her own version of the story immediately provoked a raised eyebrow and the thought that she was clearly minimizing her actual luggage, and Pinkie Pie's unending team of porter ponies carrying bags and chests galore was, if anything, even more unbelievable, Applejack's assertion that Rarity had a single porter carrying a few good-sized chests seemed the perfect middle ground. Likewise, Applejack's recollection of accidentally stumbling into Rarity and thus knocking the sandwiches overboard seems like the sort of thing that would happen, unlike either Rarity or Pinkie's explanation for that event. In the end, the story still ends with the ship sinking, and Applejack stomps off angrily, still awaiting apologies from Pinkie Pie and Rarity, each of whom is in a position to think that they deserve an apology from one of the other participants. This isn't a good scene. Unless the argument can be resolved, and apologies and forgiveness provided where it's needed, this sort of drama can do serious harm to friendships. So Twilight first sets out to piece together the common elements from each of the three stories. In the interest of somewhat simplified storytelling, due to time constraints more than the youth of the target audience, I suspect, she keys in on three factors right away, and her encyclopedic knowledge provides her with a likely answer to the how of the shipwreck. She was looking at the cucumber sandwiches, which went overboard, the resulting bubbling water, and a subsequent wave which appeared and toppled the ship. I would have remarked upon the ship itself, Pinky's contribution to food, the piñata, the appearance of the storm, and the fight over the map as being other common points. But these don't contribute to the whole how the ship went down question, so really no need for the show to address them, especially this late in the episode. Twilight gathers her friends back at Seaward Shoals by sending Pinkie Pie, Rarity, and Applejack individual notes indicating that there's a friendship emergency there and Twilight needs their help. The three arrive, yet more glorious faces are made, and Twilight explains that the emergency in question is the ongoing rift between Pinkie, Rarity, and AJ's friendship. Further, we get our first real hint that all of the three stories we've heard are subject to exaggeration in one fashion or another. The boat behind Twilight, with which she intends to recreate the events which led to the capsizing of the attempted Elegant Adventure party cruise, is of a much more reasonable size for, say, a trio of pony vacationers to rent and sail. The great ship that each of the three ponies recounted in their own tales? I strongly suspect that, in reality, it was instead something exactly like what Twilight took them out sailing in. Spike has had enough of the trio dodging the question of getting back to land, and they're a bit embarrassed to admit that the ship had gone down so close to the docks that they simply stood up and waded ashore. The whole went down in the middle of the ocean thing was a rage-fueled embellishment that all three of them had included in their tales. Twilight takes the three of them out on a new cruise, one meant to test Twilight's hypothesis about what actually sank their ship. Each of the trio comes along, convinced that Twilight's experiment will bear out their own version of events. The key points, as Twilight had discerned, were the cucumber sandwiches, their going overboard, the resulting bubbling of the water, and the sudden sea swell. For, you see, a beastie called a bunyip apparently loves cucumber, lives underwater, and the whole bubbles followed by a swell thing is what happens when one swims suddenly up from their aquatic lairs. Sure enough, a tri-horned bunyip arrives in response to Twilight's experiment, and the fellow is quite sweet and friendly. Knocking over Pinkie, Rarity, and Applejack's boat had been an accident, and not the fault of any of the three ponies. But this still left one of the sorest points of all. Each of the three ponies had gone to considerable effort to craft an ocean-going experience for the benefit of the other two, an experience which had been ruined by the careless or thoughtless actions of the others. Putting a lot of work into setting up something fun and nice for yourself, only to have someone come along and ruin it, even accidentally, well, that's bad. But when someone comes along and ruins something fun and nice you've set up for your friends, well, that's when tempers can really flare and feelings can really get hurt. And, as Twilight noted, this was the real misunderstanding, and the real source of the conflict. Sure enough, once it is explained that Rarity's striving for an elegant luxury cruise wasn't just Rarity being self-indulgent, but Rarity striving to shower her friends with indulgences. That Pinkie Pie's crazy party antics weren't just Pinkie Pie being wild and wacky because wild and wacky are what amuse her, and that Applejack's pirate adventure was less because she was bored with the same old from her friends, and more because she didn't want her friends to be bored at all. The light dawned, and each of the three could see how misunderstandings and miscommunications had led to their falling out. Apologies and reconciliation all the way around, and we close with the moral that even the best of friends with well-established relationships still need to work at communication from time to time. A lovely lesson, and a great closing shot in an episode where there's some amazing animation. The ponies and their new friend the bunyip having a good time. Which does lead me to a final point. If any of my gentle viewers are venturing into the waterways of Australia for some fun canoeing, be wary. The bunyip is a mythical amphibious beastie, the Loch Ness Monster persuasion, that supposedly haunts the inland waterways of that continent. The Aboriginal people of Australia would caution you that bunyips are only rarely as gentle and friendly as Sir Bunyip here. Instead, according to the local folklore, they are renowned for sinking ships and snatching people away to be drowned. In short, if a bunyip attempts to overturn your boat, cucumber sandwiches are not the snack it seeks. Flee at once. If you wish to see my full reaction to My Little Pony: Friendship is Magic, Season 6, Episode 22, titled Pony Point of View, the link, as I mentioned earlier, is in the description. Feel free to leave any comments or likes for that reaction here on this Afterthought review. And until next time, as always, kindly remember, y'all are awesome. Stay awesome.